How to set up a front-end project in 2025. Let's say you build a website. Before you start, you need to set up a few tools to make your life easier. But which tools should you set up? The JavaScript ecosystem is changing so fast that picking the best tool for you can be overwhelming. In this video, I walk you through setting up a front-end project from scratch. We build a vanilla JavaScript project and the React project. We are going to cover in detail what are the must-have editor extensions that you should have and how to set them up. Then we cover how to find JavaScript libraries and how to add them to your project. I will explain why you should use Node.js even if you want to build a front-end project. And finally, we set up an application bundler that will generate a live preview as you code in your browser. So let's start with the foundations. As a web developer, you mostly edit text, so you need a good editor. If you don't have a personal preference, then I highly recommend VS Code. It's by far the most used editor. One of the greatest features of all the mainstream editors is that you can add extensions to them. Let's walk through two extensions that are must-haves. Prettier is an extension that makes your code more readable and more consistent. Let's say you copy-pasted some code and it's hard to read. The tabulation is off, a line is too long, and so on. Then just save the file and suddenly everything looks as it should be. That's what Prettier does. It formats the code based on best practices. It doesn't just fix tabulation and wrap the lines. It also adds parentheses to improve code readability, makes sure that you're consistent with quotation marks, and many more. To make this work in VS Code, first we need to install the Prettier extension. In VS Code, go to the Extensions panel, search for Prettier, then install it. Installing this extension doesn't format your files automatically on save by default. The default behavior is that once you install this extension, you can right-click within a file and select Format Document. You can also select part of a file and then select Format Selection. The first time you do this, you have to select the default formatter. You might have not noticed, but VS Code already has a formatter. It just isn't as powerful as Prettier. So now that we have two formatters, we have to set that in the future, when it comes to formatting, we want to use Prettier. If you want to auto-format your files on save, you need to change a setting. Go to Settings in your VS Code Preferences and search for the Format on Save option. By default, this is false, so make sure that you tick this checkbox. After that, formatting should happen automatically every time you save a file. Formatting can be controversial though. In most cases, especially for beginners, I highly recommend the default settings. But if you prefer a different style, you can customize things. If you only have one line where you want to keep things as you wrote them, then you can indicate that with a comment. For instance, if you want to ensure that this array doesn't get turned into this, then you can write Prettier ignore as a comment before it, and it will stay as it is. If you have more general problems with Prettier's formatting, then you can create a config file and list your preferences. This configuration needs to have a specific name, and it needs to be in the root folder of our project. So let's create a JSON file called .prettierrc and add a few options. A typical option could be if you prefer single quotes instead of double quotes, or if you don't want to use semicolons at the end of your lines. With this configuration, once you save your files, you should see a different output. There are many more options, of course. If you want to dig deeper, just Google Prettier config and you will see many more options. But if you're a beginner, then again, you should probably stick with the defaults. Before we get to the second must-have extension, we need to set up a few other things. First, we need to talk about Node.js. Node is often associated with backend development, but that's not entirely true. Node is a JavaScript runtime. It runs JavaScript files outside of the browser. There are two ways of running JavaScript code. You can either have it as part of a website and run the entire website in a browser, or run only the JavaScript file with a runtime like Node. Let me show how it works. Here we have a very simple JavaScript file that prints hello world to the console. If we have Node installed, we can go to this folder in the terminal and run this file with Node like this. You can see that the file was executed and the result is on the console. That's what Node really is, a tool that runs JavaScript files on their own. JavaScript mostly behaves the same way in both environments. However, there are some differences between what JavaScript can do in the browser and what it can do when you're running it with Node. For instance, when running in the browser, JavaScript can access and modify HTML elements. That's the main point of having JavaScript in the first place. In Node, there's no HTML file. JavaScript runs on its own. On the other hand, in Node, JavaScript has access to your file system and can read and write your files. For instance, you can run scripts on your machine to initialize a project. We are going to do that. You can also use Node to check your files and correct mistakes. Or you can run your test files. In short, Node lets you run some tools that make your life much easier as a developer. So let's install Node on our computer. Maybe you already have it. To check if you already have Node installed, go to your terminal and type node-v. If this gives you a version number, you already have Node. If you don't, go to Node.js.org and install the latest stable version marked as LTS. Once the installation has finished, you can return to your terminal and double-check that Node has been installed with Node-v. So to answer the question, why do people associate Node with backend development? If the backend code is written in JavaScript, the servers need to run it somehow on their own without a browser. So yes, if you are a backend developer using JavaScript, then you're most probably going to use Node. But Node is much more than that. Now that we have Node, we can use a live server to see our site live in the browser as we develop it. Without this, you need to manually refresh the browser window every time you make a change. These tools are called bundlers because they take all your files and turn them into a neat package that you can run in the browser. Why do you need them? First of all, they can do this live. Anytime you save a file, you immediately see the result in your browser. And second, as web development tools have evolved, the moment you use anything more advanced, the browser won't understand your files. For instance, are you using React? Then you're using the JSX syntax, the one that looks like HTML. The JSX syntax is not part of JavaScript. You need a tool to convert that into plain JavaScript, otherwise it won't run in your browser. Or are you using TypeScript? You also need to turn that into JavaScript. Or if you're using Sass or any other CSS dialect, you need to convert it to plain CSS. And most importantly, if you are importing libraries with the JavaScript module system, then you need a live server to avoid coarse issues in your browser. So this is what bundlers do. They make sure that you can use modern-day tooling while you're developing your application, and they can also create a final production build that you can publish on the internet. So how to pick a bundler? Several options are available, and essentially they all do the same thing. The difference between them is in their performance, their configuration options, and their ease of use. The most used bundler is still Webpack, one of the earliest bundlers on the field. But the one that seems to take over the throne and gain more and more popularity is Vite. Here's a chart from the latest edition of the State of JavaScript survey. This chart shows how the sentiment changed over the years regarding different tools and libraries. You can see that while most developers have used Webpack, they have had more and more negative opinions about it over the years. At the same time, Vite's popularity is rising while still maintaining a positive sentiment. If you haven't checked out the State of JavaScript survey before, I highly recommend going through it. It gives you an excellent overview of the latest trends with JavaScript. You can learn which tools and libraries people love to use and which ones they will abandon soon. If you feel overwhelmed by all the changes in the JavaScript ecosystem, this survey's result can be a great guide. Now let's get back to our project. Once we have a folder for our project, let's navigate to it with our terminal. The easiest way to do this is to open the folder in VS Code and then use the built-in terminal. VS Code will open the terminal with the correct folder. Then you can run the project in the terminal with npx vite. npx is a command line tool that comes with Node. This is one of the reasons we installed Node, to be able to run commands like this. In this case, we use this script to run the project. The first time you run this script, it will ask you to install vite. Say yes. Then it will show a URL of a local server that you can open in the browser to see your project. Now if you update a file and save the changes, the new version should appear in the browser immediately. It will generate a live preview of your site till you stop this script or you close the terminal. In general, you can keep it running while you're developing your site. Then once you have finished, you can press Ctrl+C to stop the script. If it gets desynchronized or you break it with an error, then you can also restart it by pressing Ctrl+C to stop it and then running the same script again. So that's how you run a project with vite. Now that we have Node, we can also use npm or Node Package Manager to add libraries to our project. npm is another tool included with Node. So how does it work? First, I will walk you through setting things up step by step in a manual way, so it's clear how the different parts come together. And then I will show you how to automate most of these steps. So navigate to your current folder in the terminal and run npm init --yes to initialize the project. This command initializes a package.json file with some metadata. At this point, this file is not very interesting. It contains the project name, description, version number, and so on. You can change these values. It gets more interesting when you start adding libraries to our project. If you follow my channel, you have probably seen my JavaScript game tutorials where I use Three.js to render 3D games. So how do we add Three.js in our project? Go to your terminal again, make sure that you're in the correct folder, and run npm install Three. This command will install Three.js. But how do you know that the keyword is Three here and not Three.js? When you don't know the package name, you can just Google npm and the name of the library that you need. This time we know that we want to use Three.js, but even if you don't, you could search for, let's say, npm 3D library and see what Google comes up with. It will list several packages. We can go through these one by one and pick one based on their capabilities and other infos. These packages mostly come with a description and quick examples to give you an idea of what this library can do for you. The list also contains Three.js, and let's say that's the one we pick in the end. Another indicator you might want to look out for is the weekly downloads and the time of the last update to make sure that you're selecting an actively maintained library that people still use. If you found the package you're looking for, you can see the command to install it at the top right corner, npm i3. The I here is just a shorthand for install. The other way to find out how to install Three.js is to go to its official documentation and check the installation guide. That will also tell you to use npm install. Here it also adds a save flag. The save flag is legacy for old versions of Node. You can ignore it. This installation guide also gives you a hint on how to use Three.js in your JavaScript file with the import statement. We will check it out in a minute. So let's get back to the editor. When we run this command, three things are happening. First, it will add the latest version of Three.js in your package.json file as a project dependency. Then it will also create a package log file. This file is for npm to keep track of the dependencies. You don't need to know how it works. Both of these things, the dependency section of your package.json file and the package log file, are things that you should never edit manually. To add, remove, or update packages, you should always use commands like npm install and uninstall. The third thing that happens once you run the npm install command is that the Node modules folder gets created. This is the folder where the actual source code of Three.js will be. So when you import Three.js in your project, it will look it up in this folder. The content of this folder is also something that you should never change. You can look into it if you're interested in the source code of the library that you're using, but you shouldn't change it. If something goes wrong and you have an error with your dependencies that you can't figure out, then you can always safely delete the Node modules folder and the package log file and reinstall your dependencies based on the package.json file. This is not something that you should do, but you can always go back to having a clean slate. Now that we have installed Three.js, we can create a simple website that displays a 3D box. It's a simple HTML file and a JavaScript file with the code for the 3D box. The key here is that we import Three.js with the import statement in the JavaScript file, just as we saw it in the installation guide. This import will use the package that we just installed. Using imports means that we also use the JavaScript module system. We need a bundler to run a project with the module system. Otherwise, the browser will throw a course error. With vite, we can simply go to the terminal and run this with npx vite. If you want to learn more about building 3D games with Three.js, I have good news for you. A brand new Three.js game tutorial is coming up next. Subscribe to my channel to make sure that you don't miss it. Up next, let's talk about the second must-have extension for your editor. The second must-have extension is ESLint. While Prettier was formatting the code, ESLint can give you coding tips. It helps you avoid some basic mistakes and patterns that might cause you a bug. Can you spot the problem here? This is a simple example where you declare a variable, but then you have a typo and you try to use another variable that doesn't exist. ESLint will highlight this for you. It will give you an error both at the variable declaration, saying that you created a variable that you don't use, and at the usage, saying that you're trying to use a variable that is not declared. With ESLint, it's easy to spot that you made a typo. ESLint, of course, is much more complex than just catching a simple error. There are also less obvious ones where you might not understand at first why ESLint is complaining. Then you can always click this link to see more details explaining why this pattern is considered harmful and what you can do to avoid it. So how can we use ESLint in our project? This time we need to have two things, an extension and a configuration. First, as we did with Prettier, we have to install the ESLint extension. So go to your extensions, search for ESLint and install it. Then we also need to set up ESLint for our project. Before we do that, we need to make sure that the project already has a package.json file. If you don't already have a package.json file, then first we have to run npm init --yes to initialize the project. Then we can generate an ESLint config with npm init @eslint/config@latest. This script will ask you a few questions. Based on your answers, it will customize the configuration and the rules to check. You can use the default answers for most of the cases. First, you have to say yes for installing ESLint. Then it will ask you whether to use ESLint only for syntax checks or to find problems as well. Choose the second option. Then select that we use it with JavaScript modules. We use JavaScript modules if we have imports and exports in our code. Then it will ask what framework we are using. If we select the framework, then it will add framework-specific rules to our project. For instance, if we use it with React, it will enforce us to define the prop types. If you don't use a front-end framework, just vanilla JavaScript, then select none of these. Then it will ask if the project is using TypeScript. We will talk about TypeScript in a bit. It asks where you run the code. As we have a front-end project, select Browser. Then it will ask if you want to install the additional dependencies that are required for the rules based on your selections. Select Yes. It will also ask what package manager we use. We haven't talked about this, but there are multiple package managers that we can use. Let's just select the default npm. These were a lot of questions. Let's see what happened. After this step, we have ESLint and some other dependencies based on your answers in the package.json file as development dependencies. Development dependency means that ESLint won't be part of your website's final code, but you need it during development. Now that we have installed ESLint, it is also part of our Node modules folder. In fact, there are many more packages here now. This is because a dependency can have another dependencies, and the dependencies of the dependencies will also be part of the Node modules folder. ESLint also created a config file that sets up the rules based on your answers. We get back to this shortly. And now with ESLint working, you should also see errors in the code once something is off. If we go to our JavaScript file and try to use an undeclared variable, ESLint will highlight the issue. ESLint is also highly customizable. For instance, we might not want to mark an unused variable as an error. First, let's go to the error pop-up and select the identifier of this type of the error. Then let's go to ESLint config and override this error. Here we can reduce the severity to a warning, or we can completely turn off this rule. However, if you're a beginner, I'd highly recommend following the rules that ESLint has by default. Sometimes it might be annoying to fix all the seemingly harmless issues, but all these rules are based on industry best practices, so it's good to follow them. For more details, check out ESLint's documentation. So this was the step-by-step process. We used npm init to initialize the project, set up ESLint manually, and run our project with vite. Vite can also initialize the project with a sample application and all the necessary files. This is especially handy when we set up a React project. So let's see how to set up a vanilla JavaScript and the React project. Let's navigate to the terminal to a folder that will contain our project. This time we don't need to create a project folder because the script will create it for us. Then type npm create vite at latest to initialize a new project. First, it will ask you what the project name should be. This will also be the name of the folder that gets created as the project root. Then it will ask what framework you use. If you don't use any framework and you want to use plain old JavaScript, then pick vanilla. If you use React, then pick React. Then it will ask you if you want to use TypeScript or JavaScript. Here the default is TypeScript. If you're a beginner in web development, choose JavaScript. If you are more confident with your skills, then go with TypeScript. TypeScript is more complicated, but it became the industry standard in web development, and most jobs require you to know it. But if you are just a beginner, then you can go with JavaScript. Now we can navigate to the new folder created and check out what we have here. If we choose a vanilla JavaScript project, then you can see that it generated a simple application with an HTML file, a CSS file, and some JavaScript files. You can change these or even delete them as you like. You are going to need an HTML file as an entry point, but you can replace the rest. We also have a package.json file. If you created this project this way, Vite bundles itself into dependencies. You can add more dependencies to your project with npm install. This package.json file now also has a script section. This section can define scripts to run your app locally, create a production build, or test your application. You can run them with npm run. So for instance, to run the application, you can open the terminal with the correct folder and run npm run dev. This will run Vite locally. Instead of npx vite, which will run a remote script, this will run the local script in the development dependency that you see in package.json. To run this one though, first we need to install it. As we just generated this with vite, it didn't install our dependencies. We don't have a Node modules folder yet. In the terminal, you can run npm install to install all the dependencies in your package.json file. Vite does not install ESLint when you create a vanilla project, but you can always install it manually as we did before with npm init at eslint/config at latest. If you choose React as a framework when we initialize the project, then we have a couple more files. For instance, we have an ESLint config with the recommended settings for React. We also have a vite config that enables to use React. And we have a sample application that we can run. To run this app, we need to install the dependencies. So let's go to the terminal and run npm install. This will install all the dependencies, including React. Then we can run this app with npm run dev, and we have a working React application. What happens once you finish developing your app? How do you upload it to the web and share it with the world? That's the topic of a future video. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you in the next one.